This video is sponsored by World Anvil. I just talked about this in another video, but lately I just haven't been that excited about world building. I like creating a local area where adventures can happen, but I already have one of those in my current campaign. I don't really need to generate another one right now. I love creating pantheons, but I've already got a pantheon I'm really happy with, so I don't need to create any more gods at this moment. And when it comes to fleshing out the nations and civilizations that are contemporary, that the players could go and visit during the course of this campaign or future campaigns, I just haven't felt inspired or motivated. But I was rewatching Matt Colville's world building streams where he generated a random map and used it as the baseline to inspire world building. He would look at the map and say, oh, there's this broken mountain range running through the middle of the map. That would make trade really challenging. Controlling the mountain pass would give you a lot of power. We could put a fallen dwarven kingdom in the mountains and make those the former superpower of the area, but now they're gone, which means these mountains are full of monsters. But it also means there's a power vacuum on the surface world. He would basically look at the map and logically deduce what sort of cultures would make sense for that region and what sort of dramatic conflicts they could get into that would open the door for some interesting D&D campaigns. Now, I had tried something similar during a Patreon live stream, I think during the first year of my channel. I went to one of my favorite D&D world building tools, a free website called Asgard's Fantasy Map Generator, and I used it to generate a really big map, and I tried to figure out some cultures for that world. The nice thing is this map actually gives you places you can put those fantasy cultures. It'll invent kingdoms and towns. Now in this case, I don't need it to do the work of creating kingdoms and towns. Part of the process was going to be still doing that work myself. But I could still use the randomly generated suggestions for where the elves lived versus where the humans lived and where the dwarves lived and where the giants lived and so on. I didn't have to use the kingdoms and the sort of factions, but I could still use the placement of species. But working off of that prompt didn't really inspire me, at least at the time. And as I talked about in that other video, my plan was literally just to move my games into the setting Matt Colville created on stream and call it a day. After all, it was a solid little setting, and I'm not planning on running any actual play games in that world anytime soon. I literally just need a world for my homebrew games, so the world Matt Colville created would suit my purposes just fine. But as I was rewatching these streams and seeing Matt specifically using geography as the point of inspiration, I realized maybe the reason I wasn't inspired to world build last time I tried this is specifically because I used too much of what this randomly generated map gave me. I didn't use the suggestions for different kingdoms or religions, but I still used their suggestions for where you could find different species, like orcs and goblins and dark elves. Which means I wasn't really replicating the process Matt Colville went through when he generated a map and just used the map's geography as his prompt for world building all these different cultures. Now, the reason he was able to do this is because he went through a bunch of different maps looking for a map that would inspire him with some sort of interesting geographic details. And he found it with the mountain range running through the middle of the map, broken by a single narrow pass. And so I thought, well, maybe I just need to try world building in a smaller region, not necessarily trying to build a whole continent, but maybe focused on a more contained region like Matt did. But instead of trying to generate the biggest and most comprehensive map I can focus on a smaller region that also just has an interesting geographic detail. And so I literally pulled out my phone as I was listening to these live streams, and I went back to that website and started generating maps. And this was the second result. And it was everything I was looking for. Now, I didn't seriously think I was going to use any of the maps I was given when I was trying this exercise. If I did think that, I would have done it on my desktop computer so I could download the map I liked and re-upload it again in the future so I could access it through the website in the future. That way, I could actually look at the other tabs and see the suggestions for different cultures or religions and use that as some inspiration for world building. And look, at the very least, on a desktop computer, I can take a better screenshot of it. It would at least be framed horizontally. I was holding my phone vertically, so it generated a map that was framed vertically. But honestly, I am kind of happy I didn't do this on a desktop computer. I don't need to know the suggestions that the system gave me for kingdoms and religions and where the different ancestries live and different crests for noble houses. In fact, it's more interesting for me to try to create as much of that stuff as I'm interested in based off of only one prompt. Just the geography. And by not feeling locked into a really crisp screenshot that's even formatted correctly for a map, I can free myself to manipulate some of these biomes if I want to move some things around, because ultimately I know I'm going to have to wind up making my own version of this map. This resolution is not good enough for a home game, but that means I'll be able to lengthen or shorten rivers or add forests or do whatever I need to personalize this world. Because the most important thing I took away from this was the overall geography. A continent almost as long across as Australia or the United States, with rainforests on one side and grasslands on the other, and some really well-placed and solid rivers, and some really dynamic and very interesting and exciting coastlines, and most importantly, a huge fuck-off glacier right in the middle of the map. And you know what? This still has a pretty good selection of different biomes. Sometimes when you generate a map, you get really a lot of one biome and none of the others are really represented, or not enough of them are. And I want to make sure whatever map I generate has basically every biome you can expect to find in D&D represented on the map. Well, we've got forests on the borders and to the south, swamps on the southern and eastern border, which makes sailing a lot trickier there since it's hard to build ports in that area. You have to clear that whole section if you're going to do that. There's a little patch of desert in the southwest, which is really appropriate because I tend to run games for Americans, and that's where we tend to, experience deserts in our own country. But there are also frozen deserts and frozen forests around the glacier. All we need are some mountains, and we've basically got every environment in the game all in one continent. And the brown around the glacier is supposed to be tundra. Tundra is usually pretty high elevation. We could just swap that out for mountains. We can use that as our mountain equivalent. And you know what? I can decide that there are mountains all underneath the glacier. We can't really see them that well from this angle. We could decide there's a massive mountain range in the middle of the continent and the glacier is sitting on top of it. So maybe the entire middle section is all mountainous. Or maybe these mountains that we see around the glacier basically formed a perimeter around a more diverse selection of biomes that used to be in the middle of this map. But now all that stuff is completely frozen over. This map is basically like, imagine the United States of America, but the American heartland was completely frozen over. So, the United States in 10 years when climate change kills us all. I'm just kidding, that's not what's going to happen. We'll actually die specifically because there won't be any glaciers left. Science is neat. Now, obviously, this is a very weird array of terrain. I'm not exactly an expert, but it feels pretty unlikely you would get a glacier in the middle of a continent this biologically diverse. But this is a fantasy world. The glacier doesn't have to be there because it was naturally occurring. I think the whole middle section of this map was magically frozen. And it probably happened all at once. It wasn't a gradual process. There was some incredibly momentous and historical and horrible day where the middle of this continent was just flash frozen. And it does not thaw the warmer it gets or the colder it gets. It just maintains as this icy block that is, hundreds of miles across. And maybe because I'm thinking about the mountain range in the middle of Calabris, or the capital of the Fire Nation in Avatar, which is also in a crater, so therefore it's also surrounded by mountain ranges that run all the way around them. But I think the middle of the continent was this seat of power for some massive empire. Maybe there was even a volcano in the middle of this continent. That would certainly line up with the Fire Nation analogy, since that was a volcanic crater. I was actually talking about this with a friend, and he suggested maybe that volcano was going to erupt, and a cabal of wizards tried to prevent it by using ice magic and wound up overdoing it and freezing this entire region. And that's definitely a possibility. In fact, I would even go so far as to say that some people in the world might believe that theory about what happened. It's also possible that the nation in the mountains drew power from the volcano and somebody used ice magic to try to eliminate that resource and cut them off from their power source because they were their enemies. That's also something some people might believe. But I think most people absolutely have no idea what happened. And honestly, I don't want to confirm it right now. Eventually, I'm sure I will figure out an answer to that question, but right now it's something the players would have no way of figuring out. And I like leaving that as an open mystery for the players to see if they want to investigate it and try to figure out what happened, or if they're only interested in this ancient empire in terms of what artifacts they can loot from the ruins beneath the glacier. One of my all-time favorite Matt Colville videos has to be the one where he discusses the role of dead empires in our D&D games. The way all of our games are essentially post-apocalyptic, and the ways these fallen empires can help shape your campaigns. Not only can these ruins of a fallen empire help your game by giving you a bunch of different dungeons where people can find old magic items from a forgotten age, but they also offer this framework for a long-form mystery if your players want to try to learn more about these fallen empires. And what they learn about these empires and how they're perceived by the common people can give you a lot of interesting drama to explore in your stories. And so I already have a lot of different ideas about what the culture would have been like in the empire that existed in the center of this continent. But for new players joining this world for the first time, all they would really know is that in the center of this landmass is a massive glacier, and beneath that glacier lies the ruins of a frozen kingdom. But looking at this map, where do the people live now? That's the challenge I've been having with world building, is trying to figure out what cultures currently exist and where they are and who they're opposed to. But let's try to use this map as inspiration. Well, this bay to the south is probably where the most advanced, flourishing civilization would be, since you've got a great place for lots of different port cities altogether, plus lots of resources, and a great way to bottleneck to make sure you can't be ambushed by a navy. Culturally, I imagine these humans would be modeled after Greeks or Romans. To the east of them, you've also got this good section for ports, but it's in a forested region, so I think it's probably ruled by an elven civilization, which is why the southern side of the continent hasn't been conquered, and no one has secured a safe passageway from one side of the continent to the other. The southern nations are in conflict over that territory. It also means some factions might want to unite these nations into one empire, and Others would definitely want to make sure that doesn't happen. This is not a video about factions, but I'm sure we're going to have some ideas for some factions that will arise through this process, and maybe we'll flesh some of those out in a future video. If people are interested in that, let me know in the comments. Meanwhile, I think the northern forest is more full of goblins and orcs and stuff. Yes, I don't consider orcs to be evil by default. They would have their own civilizations and settlements. And just like the world Matt Colville created on that livestream, Collaboris, some of the orcs would want to work with the humans and have good relationships with them, but others would be a lot more hostile as they try to preserve their independence. Just like the elves and humans are fighting in territory in the south, humans and orcs are fighting over territory in the north. And the fact that the forest stretches around basically the entire side of the continent means some of the forest-based cultures, like goblins and orcs, could potentially move through the forest and sneak into any part of any civilization. Plus, they could ride up and down the rivers and sail around to other settlements, which is perfect because I always like to characterize my orcs more like Vikings, and this map lends itself really well to that, since so many people would have been forced onto the coasts after the glacier was created. I think I can spread out the desert to dominate more of the southwest to limit the amount of obvious farmland, cut off the north from the south a little more, and add in some more awesome, dangerous dune shit to the map. I'll keep those patches of green as an oasis between the desert and the glacier, and we'll come back to the desert later and add some more elements and settlements and things, but that desert is also the reason the humans in the south haven't completely dominated the entire west of the map. Also, any good D&D map needs a place to find each kind of dragon, so a huge desert is the perfect place to find some blue dragons. We obviously have the forests for the green dragons, swamps for black dragons, and the glacier for white dragons, of course. And you know that there are rumors that if you go under the glacier and under the dungeons beneath the ice and you get down to the buried volcano, you know what kind of dragons are supposed to be down there. We can also obviously put giants on the map, frost giants on the glacier, fire giants in the lava tubes below. My friend suggested there might be storm giants on a flying castle above the glacier. They might come down occasionally or send emissaries down to meet with the other giants to basically manage the ordning. I'm not going to confirm that, but you know, that would be a nice option to have, I'm sure. Of course, going down and visiting the fire giants would be a challenge since that whole culture was trapped underground. So the fire giants might have changed a lot. They might have formed their own society. They might not be compatible with the ordning as we know it anymore. I think there are some human cultures hidden in the jungles and rainforests to the east, and they're at war with the snake men also in the jungle. Now, I want to be clear. I would never put Yuan-Ti in my campaign world. That's a copyrighted term belonging to Wizards of the Coast. I don't even know why you brought them up. That's kind of an non sequitur. Let's try to stay on topic and talk about the snake men that I mentioned instead of the weird Yuan-Ti. Is that what they're called? Whatever you mentioned. We're not going to talk about those. Let's talk about snake men. So yeah, I want to put snake men in the jungles because snake men are cool. And I think the cold-blooded creatures would feel pretty fucking frustrated that there's this huge glacier in the middle of the continent now, severely limiting the amount of territory they can even live in, let alone have access to. I think they also used to live in the desert, which is across the continent, and they probably traveled between the two through the center of the map. But now, they literally can't survive in the mountain tunnels because they're frozen over, unless they can get down into the lava tubes, and that's not exactly very safe. We talked about a bunch of things that might be down there that are dangerous. So the snake men to the east want to reestablish a link to the desert, but to do that, they need to get access to the sea. So they're trying to take over the few human settlements on the coast and put those humans to work building ships and maybe draft them into an army to help reclaim the deserts. I realize in a way this is kind of like the inversion of the snake men of Collaboris. In Collaboris, the snake men were at war with the humans because they were losing their war with the dragonborn in the desert, and so they were fleeing the desert into human lands. In this world, the snake men basically have their back against an ice wall and they're pushing into human territory because it would help them reach their ultimate goal of reconnecting with another former settlement by getting access to the sea. This also means sometimes you just get snake men making their way west, either through the north or south, in a mission to try to reach the desert. Meanwhile, the humans in the east might be more inspired by Mayan people. I've spoken before about the sort of complicated and loaded racial implications of the fact that the Yuan-Ti in D&D, which I guess are semi-related to this topic because they're snake men, but in all seriousness, the Yuan-Ti in D&D are sort of culturally presented as if they're inspired by South American culture. But ultimately, that's only an issue if they're the only form any South American representation takes in your game. I don't mind someone linking snake men to a real-world culture that did make snakes a major part of their culture. Like, I see how you got there, and I think ziggurats are cool. I don't mind having snake people hanging out in ziggurats. I just don't think they should be the only way that that real-world culture represents itself in your world. So the humans to the east would probably also be heavily inspired by the Mayans. They would live in ziggurats as well, and they might even have conflicting creation myths from the snake men. Both of them believe their ancestors built these temples and that they have a claim to this land. So the humans aren't just going to run away and join the elven nation to the south or the raiders to the north. they have their own culture, and they're going to protect it from the invading snakemen. So there we have our conflict. Now, the Northwest has what would be easily considered the best farmland on the map, so there would probably be people fighting to control it. I think there are a few human kingdoms up here, all battling for control like it's Settlers of Catan. One of those kingdoms has made their home in the mountains. They live in an old stronghold from the Frozen Kingdom, and that's their capital city. And it's also at the edge of a frozen forest. So they dress in furs, and their culture is probably a lot more Nordic. It's also a good position for security. It gives them a chance to control more of the farms that the other human kingdom can't reach, but it also means they have to deal with a whole lot more goblins and orcs and stuff coming from the forests to the east. They also might be able to plunder the ruins of the glacier for gold and silver and jewels and ancient relics, but that also means they're dealing with the monsters in the mega dungeons. A friend of mine suggested that treasure hunting could be a major cultural cornerstone to their society, especially if it mirrors Nordic culture. Instead of raiding other colonies, they gather parties to run the dungeon, wearing ornamented bones of the monsters they slay and boasting about the trinkets and relics they discover. That also helps get rid of some of the more problematic aspects of the way Vikings would raid villages and do certain things to the villagers. That's not really something we need to worry about when you're heading into a mega dungeon and fighting monsters. It's just not a concern in the same way. Meanwhile, the other kingdom in this region is on the coast, and culturally they're more classic medieval fantasy, inspired by medieval England, especially in the Arthurian sense. I think the Northeast is just wild and unconquered wilderness, since the jungle's too thick for any one civilization to clear enough land for an empire without being constantly raided by goblins and orcs and everyone else who's also up there. And then, of course, you've got the Underdark equivalent in the center of the map, far underneath the glacier. So that's where you'd find all the dark elves and dark dwarves and deep gnomes and spider people, etc. And, of course, the cities of the Frozen Kingdom are reachable through the tunnels underneath, which basically turns it into different tiers of a mega dungeon. Now, I believe that any D&D world should include each official ancestry, at least from the core rulebook. So we still have a few playable species to put on the map. Now, honestly, for things like Aasimar and tieflings and halflings and gnomes, I think the fun of those species is that they don't really have a specific homeland. The fun, the appeal of them is that they can kind of pop up anywhere. Maybe at your home game, a halfling player might say, oh, I'm from a Shire equivalent, but that's basically just one town or valley that you can add to the map as needed. They don't have to have their own nation to claim as their own, because I just don't think that's part of the fantasy for those ancestries. Tieflings and Aasimar work the same way. The idea is that you might be from a family of Aasimar, or you were a tiefling born to humans or whatever, but there's probably not a whole tiefling nation. Now, I definitely have my own idea for a former kingdom of tieflings, but that would be more of a dungeon you explore rather than something you specifically find on the map as a current existing faction. Dwarves, on the other hand, do need a homeland of some sort. They need a home base. Again, the origin of dwarves in our hobby is really more than anything else the Hobbit and the Fellowship of the Ring, more so than any other text or mythology. And in those books, the dwarves live under the mountains in these vast kingdoms. So I think you can find an enclave of them here. These are the last dwarves on the map in their own homeland. Other dwarves would have scattered to other settlements. You would absolutely find some dwarves living among humans, or maybe even the elves, because their ancestors had to flee the Great Freezing, or whatever they called it. Probably not that. That sucks. But they had to run away when a glacier suddenly appeared and took over their land. Now, I realize that Calabris also had a fallen dwarven kingdom in the middle of the map and another enclave of dwarves off in their own mountain range. I get it, but those dwarves in their own little enclave had actually overthrown the Dwarven Empire in the middle of the map. Here, I think this little enclave was a satellite of the larger dwarven nation, and they are now trying to mount missions back into the mountains to reclaim their homeland. Basically just like Thorin and his group from the Hobbits. Additionally, I don't think the entire empire in the middle of the map was all dwarven. I think the dwarves lived in the mountain range, and they basically had a very symbiotic relationship with the humans who lived in the middle of the map. Everyone worked together because the empire in the center of the map maintained peace. The snake men could cross peacefully across the entire map. The dwarves had their own kingdom that spanned great distances all around this perimeter, but they could trade with humans at all these different points. Everybody was thriving. But then the glacier hit, and everything got screwed up. So it's not exactly the same as Calabris, but yeah, I'm also very aware that the legacy of a fallen dwarven empire is exactly the same thing as what Matt Colville was doing in those world building live streams that I was literally watching when I was inspired to go through this process myself. I know this is not an original idea, it's not one Matt even came up with himself, but I also know that it's kind of an exact parallel to what happened in the live streams that inspired me. But also, and I really can't stress this enough, I don't really care. It's cool, and I like it, and I'm doing it too. And I get the feeling Matt Colville wouldn't really care if I stole this idea from the world that he created to inspire people to do more world building. Now, with Goliaths, we've got to put them in the world somewhere. But kind of like with halflings and gnomes, I don't think you necessarily need a whole kingdom of Goliaths, because you can imagine that they might just have some small enclaves, but not a full kingdom. But they're also not all individual creatures born of a meeting between humans and Goliaths, the way tieflings and Aasimar could be with their respective heritage. So your Goliaths still need to come from somewhere. My friend Zach suggested you might find the Goliaths in harsher climates because their giant lineage means they can weather the challenges better. The pun was not intended by Zach, but the emphasis is mine. So for example, I think there's a group of Goliaths on the eastern side of the glacier, probably taking up residence in the mountains, maybe in some more of the other ruins of the Empire that have been repurposed by them. Now, Dragonborn are kind of a different story. I actually do think you need to put them somewhere on the map and give them their own fully fleshed out culture. Unlike Aasimar and Tieflings, Dragonborn don't just happen, they have their own cultures. And whereas Halflings draw on the idea of hobbits, so their homeland is unassuming, and you could literally look right past it and not notice them, and gnomes in the forest work the same way in folklore, I do think Dragonborn should have a culture. Now, do I feel this way just because I like the Dragonborn kingdom in the lore from 4th edition? Or do I feel this way just because I love the nation of Dragonborn in Calabris? Or do I feel this way because I always loved the idea of Draconia from Critical Role and thought it was a shame that we never got a chance to see it? Who can say? But I like the idea of a land of Dragonborn, and specifically one that is a little bit removed from everywhere else. The challenge I have when putting Dragonborn on the map is that nothing I come up with will be as cool as what happened in the Matt Colville videos that inspired all this, because in that world, the Dragonborn live in a city of glass in the desert. It's the Kingdom of Zir. It's basically their Arabian analog, and that is the coolest shit in the entire world. So I wasn't really sure what to do with the Dragonborn, but I figured a good starting point is to figure out what's their origin. Where are they from? Why are they Dragonborn? Again, Zach suggested they could have been the culture that created the glacier to overthrow the dwarves or whoever was there, but I didn't like that, because if they have any obvious connection to the frost or whatever it's called, the people either are aware of that or they believe that's the case. Either way, they'll make the Dragonborn into a persecuted minority, because they are essentially responsible for the huge apocalypse that happened in the middle of the continent. And now, I know we talked recently about the ethics of making an individual species into a persecuted minority, and ultimately, I have sort of complicated feelings about it, but I do think that if you're doing it in your homebrew game, you can kind of work with your players to figure out a way to do it responsibly, whereas I feel a little less comfortable about it being prescribed by the people who publish the game. But more importantly, I don't think Dragonborn players want to feel persecuted. I think Tiefling players kind of do. I think half-elf players or orc players or half-orc players kind of do. But players who play Dragonborn want to feel cool and unique, but not necessarily persecuted against. But I do definitely think there still has to be some reason they were created. I don't like them just immigrating from another planet or reality. That's never an idea I liked. I think that's what they did in Forgotten Realms, because they had to kind of explain where they all came from, but that was kind of a necessity based on the fact that that was a pre-existing world. This is a world being created with the fact that there are already Dragonborn in existence, so how can I integrate them a little bit more? Now, in the player's handbook, they explicitly say that there was some sort of ritual or divine intervention that created the Dragonborn. So they were created by someone on purpose. That's part of the selling point to new players. But I also want to be careful not to just make them the equivalent of Warforged. Now, eventually I figured out the backstory for Dragonborn in my world. I figured out who created them and why. But I also determined that this happened so long ago, most people would have no idea how it happened. It's been lost to time. So I'm not going to tell the players what it is, and I'm not going to say it in this video. If the players want to know why do Dragonborn exist, they'll have to look into it. Just like they might have to look into why the glacier happened. But because the origin of the Dragonborn happened so long ago, long before the origins of even the empire that eventually fell to the glacier, the Dragonborn are very spread out, scattered across the land. But I do still want to give them a home base. And so when placing that, I had to figure out what's the most dramatic place to put them. What location is going to enhance the drama and the tension on this map? So I looked in the north. See, we've got these two human nations, but one of them is built into the mountains. That's a decent defensible position, but it's terrible when it comes to trade. Maybe it was a fine position for trade back when there were dwarves living in those mountains, but now there aren't. Now they're just full of monsters. And even if you shut those doors to the monsters, you're still trapped in that position. So they have to fight with the English analog, the Camelot analog, for control of the river. Not only because rivers act as a good natural border, but because without the river, the Norseman analog lose access to the port on the coast and can't trade for resources. And so I actually think this port city is run by Dragonborn, because they'll trade with whomever. They're not part of the human war. The Dragonborn city is probably even called the Free City of city name, because they're not part of any other nation or empire. They maintained their independence from the dwarves and whatever empire was within that valley, and they've been independent since Dragonborn backstory shit. I'm not telling, but there's a reason why they were considered a free city. But the Camelot equivalent are trying to get the Dragonborn to close off trade with the Norse equivalent. But the Norse can bring wealth, gold and silver, and even the occasional magic item or relic from within the glacier. So the Dragonborn aren't interested in breaking that treaty. So Camelot is trying to control the river to keep the Norse from getting north. But they'll also send people into the dungeon themselves on the western side to try to get access to their own relics, to trade, to basically make sure the Dragonborn feel like they can still get everything they want by only trading with Camelot. That would basically incentivize them to shut off trade with the with the Norse, because now they have this access to everything they want from Camelot. But that begs the question, why don't the Camelot equivalent just control their own access point into the dungeons below the glacier? So that must mean that something is keeping them from controlling this access point. So it's probably controlled by Dark Elves or Duergar. They haven't been able to control this foothold into the Old Empire because it's been conquered by other Underdark dwellers. And thanks to their battles over the river, they can't launch a full invasion into that dungeon to clear them out. And they can't go around to the next corner of the glacier because you'd have to cross the desert, and you just can't get a full army across the desert and establish supply lines easily, especially because the desert is full of huge fuck-off monsters. Which means if you start your games in our Camelot equivalent, the dungeons on the western side of the glacier are probably where a lot of adventurers are going to go at low levels, because that's something you can send adventurers to go do, but you can't really spare a full army for it. You've got a similar problem here in the south. Why don't the elves control this part of the glacier? So I think, again, this is probably where hill giants live. Once again, that's where a lot of low-level adventures will be if you start your game in the south, but also, as you go further up the glacier, you start fighting other giants and basically dealing with higher tiers of the Ordning. Now, this is good, but you know what else we need? Undead. Now, undead can happen anywhere, but we need a good, solid collection of undead. So this is the Whitewood. It's a cold forest, so at first the name seems obvious. It's perpetually winter in the forest, thanks to its proximity to the glacier, so the trees are covered in snow. It's the White Wood, that makes sense. But it's also full of undead, which is how it originally got its name. It was originally the White Wood, because it's full of whites, and other undead as well. Probably the individual people wouldn't necessarily know the difference between all the undead in there, but there's definitely a lot of undead in there. And it's one of the reasons it's so hard to mount an assault on the Norse capital. There's a forest of undead protecting them from Camelot. Camelot can't get close enough to really siege them, because anyone who dies along the way ends up joining the undead forces that are keeping them at bay. Now, I'm not exactly worried about the specific placement of the forest, and the mountains can be adjusted a little bit. This is not the final map. There's probably a mountain keeping the undead from leaving the forest and reaching the Norse, otherwise the Norse people live in the worst spot ever. They've got enough going on without also having to fight undead on their western flank. So the undead really are more of an issue for Camelot to deal with when they try to reach the glacier. But the humans of both kingdoms also have to defend their territory from the orcs and goblins coming from the east, which is why you can use other pre-published adventures that feature both those monsters basically anywhere in the northern section of this map. I'm also not going to worry too much about the specific biomes in this region or any region of the map until I actually zoom in and start prepping adventures in that area. Like, there's no way there's no swamps anywhere near Camelot. You need some swamps and mountains in that general nation because there are going to be a lot of different D&D adventures in that area. So I'm going to need to add a lot more stuff when I zoom in later. So right now, we're speaking in broad strokes. As you can tell, I'm not really worrying about even naming any of these things yet. When we actually zoom in, there'll be a lot more geographical diversity in probably all of these different regions. We already talked about the east, humans and snake men fighting over access to the port, so we've got some good conflict there. And if there are orcs and goblins and who knows what else in the jungle, then perhaps they might get involved in that fight, on one side or the other, depending on what that faction wants and which side of the war they think they're going to be able to get that from. And the dwarves still control this tiny little mountain range. In this region, I think there are border towns between the humans and the elves. They keep basically trading these towns back and forth as each side conquers new land and then maybe eventually loses it. So culturally, these towns are a blend of both cultures. Basically, it's like the towns on the French-German border. I remember learning in school that people living there basically developed a culture that was a combination of both French and German culture because the people in charge kept changing. If you're playing with half-elves in your game, there would be lots of half-elves in this area because despite the fact that the human and elf kingdoms are fighting over this territory, the human and elf citizens living there still have to share this space. They have to live together. Sometimes that means they will make lives together. Halflings are probably in the farmlands to the north. There are probably some gnomes in the forest to the south, since they share some Fey ancestry with the elves. It's a nice way to link them there. And the orcs and goblins are both building forces in the north that are trying to expand out, but they're not working together. At least, not right now. And now let's figure out what's going on in the desert. And you know what? The first thing I did was include a Middle Eastern Exandria equivalent. I'm extending the river so it's more obvious why it was built in what is now the middle of the desert, but obviously, as a big fan of Avatar: The Last Airbender, you gotta put a library in the middle of the desert. You just gotta. Also, do you remember in Game of Thrones when Sam went to that library where they train all the maesters, and it was this huge, incredible library that doesn't look anything like any other structure in Westeros, and you went, no, bullshit, this does not belong in the Seven Kingdoms, it's too fantastical for the show that we're watching, but at that point, the show was getting pretty stupid, so you just had to believe that this was the same country that also had the Red Keep and Casterly Rock instead of magical super fortresses, and you just had to accept that there was this one incredible place on this continent that didn't make any sense there. Well, I want a fancy library, and I can decide that it makes more sense in my setting because I'm building it from scratch, and I don't have a TV budget. Also, that library in Game of Thrones was actually based on Exandria, so fair enough, we're working with the same influences. I also want to place a necropolis somewhere on the river. The mages of the necropolis can animate the entombed warriors to protect the city, which means it can basically protect the library from any invasion from the sea, if it's further towards the sea than the library is. And that library also has some old, ancient wards to protect them from the desert monsters. And eventually I just kept adding cities to the river, and I was starting to realize these were getting a little bit high fantasy. And so here's what I eventually decided. On the edge of the water, right where the river meets the sea, is a trade city. It's still used today because it cuts travel in half between Camelot and Greece, whatever those nations are called. People can stop there and trade, and it's become a trade hub because of that. It's booming. But there are all these other cities along the river leading to the mountains, and each of them were these huge cities. One was a necropolis, one had a massive library and was also a wizard training city, one had a giant temple, and one of them was a huge fortress. And they're all abandoned now. Once people weren't coming to and from the sea to the mountains and back, they weren't using the river for travel to get access to the empire in the middle, it became a lot harder to arrange new resources going to these cities because no goods were flowing from the empire in the center. And so eventually people followed the river and fled to the trade city. So the people of the trade city are constantly trying to reclaim their old territory, which has been overrun by, well, who else? The snake men who used to live in the desert. But now that these cities have been emptied, the snake men have taken them over, or are trying to overcome the wards in some cases, but they're potentially gaining access to all these magical secrets that these cities once held. Now, Camelot and Greece are both absolutely willing to lend their support to the mission to retake the old cities, but the Middle Eastern-inspired port city would need to give up their sovereignty and become part of one of those two countries. And they're not willing to do that. They still cling to the idea that they are this mythic nation, even though they're literally just one city now. So in practical terms, this basically means there are 4 city-sized mega dungeons along the river leading to the glacier. Lots of locations for future adventures, and in some cases, they're overrun by snake men, and some of these snake men have access to wizard magic, or cleric magic, or undead magic, and that just gives me real big Conan vibes, and I love it. Now, as you've noticed, we're still working in very broad strokes here. None of this has been fully fleshed out, and sometimes I don't even know where to start when I'm doing that. Like, how do you even begin making up details for each new corner of a campaign setting like this? Well, if I can offer some advice if you're struggling with how to do that, you can use today's sponsor, Worldbuilding. Worldbuilding is an incredible online resource that you can use to create wiki-style articles of anything in your world. Monsters, magic items, NPCs, nations, factions, religions, anything the players might interact with, you can make an article about it. And I know what you're thinking, well, that's all well and good when I already know what lore I want to include, but I still need something that will help inspire me as I create new articles, and Worldbuilding can't help with that. Well, that's where you're wrong, because whenever you're making a new article, there are actually a whole bunch of prompts that can help guide you through the creation process. So Worldbuilding actually helps by asking you questions that might not have occurred to you, like who founded a given nation or religion or faction. If you don't have an idea for it, then no worries, don't write anything down. But if you think there might be an interesting or dramatic answer to that question, then you can go ahead and include it. And then when you're done with a given article, you can share it with your players. But Mike, you might be saying, you've talked a few times today about mysteries in your campaign world that normal people wouldn't know anything about, but now you want to write everything down and send it to your players? Doesn't that defeat the whole purpose? But you can actually choose to include certain information on Worldbuilding and make it only visible to you, so that way you're not spoiling the surprise for your players. You can keep the information about the Frozen Kingdom really ambiguous for all the player-facing material, but in your notes, which are still on the same articles, you can write down that it was a Kobold Empire, and the players won't know that unless you share it with them. Oh shit, I said that out loud, cut that part out, cut that out. And Worldbuilding is offering a discount to the viewers of this channel. If you visit worldbuilding.com/supergeekmike and use the promo code SUPERGEEK at checkout, you can save 51% off of any annual membership. Once again, that's worldbuilding.com/supergeekmike and use the promo code SUPERGEEK. Thank you so much to Worldbuilding, for sponsoring this video. Thanks for watching. We'll be back soon with a new video. I have another Demystified video coming next week, all about the episode of Critical Role where they play D&D with Vin Diesel. I was originally aiming to get that out for Halloween, but I fell a little behind, but don't worry, it's coming out next week, and I have a few other videos coming out next week as well. It's going to be a good week.
You're missing another Critical Role Demystified deadline?
Yeah, you know what? Oddwick, it's not really a big deal. I had some other stuff I wanted to talk about. These videos were sponsored, so they had to hit certain deadlines, so I prioritized those over getting that Demystified video done.
You're really testing me. When I said weekly Demystified, I meant it.
I got a Demystified video out this week, didn't I?
I wanted them out on Thursdays.
You didn't say that. You said weekly Demystified videos. Now, I thought this might be a week where I would get 2 Demystified videos out by the end of the week, but I don't think that's happening, so I'll have another Demystified video coming out next week. Don't worry. I am still going to be able to talk about Vin Diesel then. It may not be a Halloween episode anymore, but it'll still carry through the spooky season vibes. And that is still absolutely abiding by the terms of your weird curse or whatever. Besides, next Thursday, there'll be another episode of Critical Role Campaign 4, so more people will be searching for the words Critical Role on YouTube. That might mean the video does a little bit better in the algorithm. So really, next Thursday makes more sense than dropping it on Halloween. So, you know what? The real reason is that tomorrow is Day of the Dead, and that's a very important holiday to my wife and her family, and they want to do something special with our kid, so we're having a family day together. And I don't really mind that you know that. It's important to me to be able to take a holiday with my family.
Just be careful. You wouldn't want to wind up on my bad side.
Well, that was chilling. Happy Halloween! Anyway, if you want to support this channel, there are a few awesome ways you can do that. You can like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with a friend. Leave a comment. Don't let me know what you'd name anything in this world. I'm not taking suggestions, but what I would like to hear is what you would have done differently with the same prompt. Where would you have placed different cultures? Or check out Asgar's Fantasy Map Generator. The link is in the description. Generate your own map. They're not sponsoring this video or anything. Just check out the service. I think it's cool. And ignore everything else they give you. Just look at the geography and look at the biomes and see what you'd come up with. Let me know what sort of cultures or communities or tensions might be generated by the layout it gives you. Or if you've done this before in the past, let me know how it went. Fun fact, as I was writing this script, I pulled up the website to make sure I was getting the terminology right for what the different tabs were called, making sure it was the biomes tab. That's the one you want to focus on. And I got this random map, and this would have given me a completely different world with totally different conflicts and cultures. So I really do encourage you to try this method. It's a lot of fun. And you know what? Let me know what you come up with based on what the site gives you. Just sound off in the comments below. Now, if you want to see more videos from me, I've got a video here where I talk about the different ways Daggerheart handles different campaign settings, since there is a decent chance I'd be running this new world in a Daggerheart game, and I suspect the same might be true for some of you as well. So check out that video right here. And until next time, play fair and have fun.